digital transformation is the goal setting of, I used to be successful in the third industrial revolution. I need to reinvent, rewire myself to be successful in the fourth. That's transformation. That's digital transformation. Everything else is either a technology, AI, or it is a fad, or it is a buzzword, right? So set your goals right.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to have on the show Tony Saldana. Tony is president of Transformant, a consulting firm specializing in assisting organizations through digital transformations. During his 27-year career at Procter Gamble, he ran both operations and digital transformation for P&G's famed global business services and IT organization in every region of the world, ending up as vice president of global business services, next generation services. He is an advisor to boards and CEOs on digital transformation, a sought after speaker, and a globally awarded industry thought leader. His new book is called Why Digital Transformation Fails: The Surprising Disciplines of How to Take Off and Stay Ahead. It's my great pleasure to have Tony with us today. So welcome, Tony.
Thank you, James. Pleasure to be here.
So share with us all what's happening in your world just now.
Oh, the world's really exciting. So at the moment, I think the whole topic of digital transformation is uppermost on people's minds. And I feel, like a kid in a toy shop right now with so many different things to choose from. But seriously, we're in the midst of this fourth industrial revolution. And in many ways, industrial revolutions come with immense opportunities and immense challenges. And I consider ourselves fortunate to be living in a time where we can actually change, the direction of what happens to the world around us.
So you definitely consider yourself to be an optimist, because I read some books which is in terms of, or you read some studies like University of Oxford studies saying this digital transformation will result in maybe 50% of jobs disappearing. So there's that side of it, but it sounds like you're more optimistic about the future.
I am, and I think, honestly, it's all a question of the good old glass half full or half empty. Look, I think there's no denying the fact that industrial revolutions have exponential winners and exponential quote unquote losers. But I really think that whether you end up belonging to the first category or the second is right down to your attitude, because I think that this is an opportunity of historic proportions. If you wait for things to happen to you, well, unfortunately, they will. But if you grab the bull by the horns and look at this as a way to create something completely new, then you can. And this is the one lesson that I've learned through more than 3 decades in the industry, that digital and IT really doesn't wait for anybody. I think it's up to you to go and take a hold of it.
Yeah. And so in terms of countries, you've in your role and being on the global side of P&G, you've lived in different parts of the world. I know you spent much time in the Philippines, obviously in the US as well. I was in Singapore last week, and I was talking to a retail company that's involved in retail. And they're going through this whole process, thinking about how digital transformation affects the retail side of things. So when it comes to particular countries you think are going to really are in a position where they can really benefit just now, and those countries are maybe we're going to have to adjust. Talk about what those countries are, and in terms of the industries, which industries do you see that are ahead of the curve? They're really thinking about this, and which ones really need to catch up a little bit?
Yeah, so that's an interesting reference there to Singapore. I had the opportunity of living there twice. Singapore is also ranked #1 on the World Digitization Index, right? Now, we all have to kind of keep in the back of our minds that Singapore didn't even exist until the early 1960s. And when it was created, it had the per capita income of Bangladesh at that time, right? And to go from there to being where it is absolutely fantastic. So a little bit to the point earlier that you were making about attitude. So I think that you have companies like countries rather like Singapore. You have the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania that are really grabbing hold of this opportunity. I mean, I won't talk about China and Korea and some of the other countries, right? In terms of industries, you also have the equivalent of those. So you've got certain industries. I really think that parts of the finance industry are really taking advantage of this, and starting to dabble with the use of blockchain to disintermediate themselves. And I think that's fabulous because if somebody's going to disintermediate you, it might as well be yourself, right? So to answer your question, I do think that I see a lot of investments in the financial industry to really disrupt themselves, and I think that's fantastic. The media industry is hopefully halfway through this particular journey, and so you're starting to see things starting to pick up for the media industry. I think that consumer packaged goods are still probably on the uphill side of the battle, but I see very exciting trends from certainly my previous company, Procter Gamble, but several others as well that start to see that industry reshape itself. Unfortunately, I don't think the retail has hit its worst as yet, so there's going to be much more there. And the one industry that I would have loved to see do a lot of stuff in digital that I'm not as optimistic about yet is the medical field. I think they have a huge opportunity ahead.
And you would think like with something financial where you talk about a lot of structured data there, and also medical where you actually have a lot of structured data as well, you would think that those would be perfect for both of those. There's be a lot of stuff. So is it because, I'm wondering, is it because in the medical field you have this very strong hierarchy, or you call like silos? I am a medical doctor, I am a surgeon, I am an anesthetist, I am a such and such, and then there's maybe less sharing, and the idea of data is maybe a dirty word.
Yeah, no, that is exactly true. You would have thought that those two industries would be somewhat similar with all of that data available there. Quite honestly, I think the difference is that despite some amount of protection, the financial industry is still a free market economy. And the medical industry is unfortunately still a little protected, and that's what's resulting in the slow progress. I really hope that this trend is going to pick up, especially in the U.S., because I think that's really where most of the money in the pharmaceutical and medical industries is. So unlike the financial industry where you could have disruptions happen anywhere in the world, I think in the medical industry, because of the nature of the work and where the market is and things like that, the US needs to change.
So I was talking about Singapore. I was going through Singapore the other day, Changi Airport, and the new Terminal 3 of the Jewel, this beautiful location there. And I was speaking the week earlier at a conference for IoT, and the client I was speaking for was actually a Honeywell or Tridium, and they were I was, as part of that research, I was finding out there's 50,000 sensors in that one Terminal 3, all that data, all that stuff. So there's somewhere it feels like the digital transformation has gone very well, because you don't even notice the digital. It just is like a seamless type of experience. You just know wow, this is a really chilled airport. It's really relaxing. Everything kind of works. And then I contrast that, let's say even in healthcare, you're talking about healthcare. There's a stat you point out in your book, which I think, being from the UK, and we see lots of digital transformation starting to happen here, but it doesn't go so well. And there's a stat you mentioned in the book saying 70% of all digital transformation projects fail. That blew my mind that it was as high as that. So what's going on there? What are some of the fundamentals or the first principles that these companies or governments are getting wrong?
So I think there are two things that most organizations, whether they're private or public sector, get wrong. One is confusion about goal setting, which is driven, quite honestly, by misunderstanding and hype on what exactly digital transformation is. So that's part one. Part two is the execution methodology is really archaic and needs to become more disciplined. So I'll give you an example. On the first thing, when you talk to 10 different people, you're likely to get at least 9 or 10 different answers on what digital transformation is. Everything from, isn't this old? We used to have digital watches in the 1980s to all the way, as you were saying, into IoT and other stuff, right? And so one of the reasons I felt compelled to write this book is because I don't think it's that complex. We're in the fourth industrial revolution. We're being disrupted by technology, digital technology. Digital transformation is the goal setting of, I used to be successful in the third industrial revolution. I need to reinvent, rewire myself to be successful in the fourth. That's transformation. That's digital transformation. Everything else is either a technology, AI, or it is a fad, or it is a buzzword, right? So set your goals right. The second is execution. It's actually the 70% failure rate of digital transformation is very similar to the 70% failure rate of most IT traditional projects. And the reason is because we're executing digital transformation as if we were executing traditional digital IT projects. And it isn't. We're focusing too much on digital and not enough on transformation, which is an organizational change. And that's leading to that 70% failure rate. In a lot of the work that I did over the last several years, I've come up with a first of a kind methodology on how to go after digital transformation with much more rigor in the context of how to do organizational change. And again, that's the second reason why we have that dismal failure rate.
So just going from that, we often think of like digital transformation being quite a high kind of strategic type of thought process that's going on there. I'm wondering, I was at an event recently, and it was actually in New Delhi. I was speaking in New Delhi, and I was talking with someone there, and we were actually talking about the space program, the Indian Space Research Organization. And we were actually just looking at a photo of the place, the control center, where they're putting these things up to Mars and to the moon and to the space. And I was looking at that, and I was thinking, the way that the room was shaped, and the way that all that data was there, everyone could see a common view of what was going on. It was actually very easy to communicate, and it almost ran a little bit like the CERN Institute in Switzerland, where, and this is quite similar. They kind of go a little bit more into circles where they can, because they're brainstorming at different points as well. And then I started looking at, for example, being in the UK, we're going through this Brexit thing at the moment. And I was looking at the cabinet room. There was something on TV today of the cabinet room. And I'm looking at that room and I'm seeing, okay, this is a room what is intended for maybe the second industrial revolution. And there's no data, there's nothing, there's no quantitative information that's going on there, no interactive tools. I believe the only tool that's actually there, well, there's two tools that's in that room at the moment. One is a fireplace, and one, the past prime ministers used to throw the papers into the room of ministers that they didn't like their papers. And the other one is a clock, and the clock doesn't work from people I know. So kind of going in terms of digital transformation, I don't think this is talked about or very often. What role does the ergonomics of the place in which you are trying to do, the actual space in which you are trying to create that transformation, what kind of impact does that play?
Hey, that's another fascinating question. The short answer is that the ergonomics of the place completely has to support not just the culture, and I think you did a fantastic job with that contrast on bringing the culture aspect, but also enabling decisions in the place. So I'll give you an example from my own experience at Procter & Gamble. About 10 years ago, at Procter & Gamble, we actually changed the boardroom where the P&G leadership met. And it actually, it looks like a little bit, like the Starship Enterprise board, except it is 360 degrees. And it had video connectivity, even in those early days, to, general managers that were all over the world. And that's really where the leadership met on a daily basis. But it wasn't just the huge curved screens. It was the fact that those screens were supported by a dedicated analyst. So today you'd call them a data scientist. And whenever the team met, you had the latest information about what was happening over the last week to products all over the world. The quality of the conversation dramatically changes when you're working in that setting. Right? Not only do you have data and facts at your fingertips, but you do also have, a feeling that, you kind of owe it to yourself to drive much more collaboration, because you now have people face to face from all over the world. And then you have the feeling of being one team, right? And I think for me, that's an example of how the smell of the place, the aesthetics, the complete redesign is a huge supporter and an enabler of the culture.
So in that role, let's say senior leadership, they're meeting like that, they have this data, there's instant data that's there. So we often think, that contrast between what the humans do, the more softer skills and the more harder skills and the technology. So if the machines and any technology is able to be almost like the tactician now, and to be very good at producing that data, seeing patterns, for example, what are the skills that the humans now require? Because in this fourth industrial revolution, I'm guessing the skills that we need for this industrial revolution are going to be a bit different from the previous revolutions.
They are indeed, and you're absolutely right that the job profiles and the skills will change. I read a statistic, I think a couple of months ago, that said that a whole 45% of the new jobs that will exist in the next, I think they said 15 years, don't exist today, right? And we know that because, I just talked about data scientists. I mean, that job really didn't exist as a job, and certainly not as such a high-paid, exclusive job a few years ago, right? And that's part of this, positive opportunity of industrial revolutions. You go from, in the second industrial revolution, basically, running a horse carriage company to then, working in a totally different internal combustion engine, kind of role. And that's part of the transformation that needs to happen. I think, and this is really one of the reasons why I'm so positive about this whole topic, if we can learn from prior industrial revolutions on essentially upskilling and planning for what needs to happen to human capacity, to societies, we can make sure that this happens as a positive revolution. And that's really, a part of what my mission is. I think the future is going to be, quite frankly, as it has always been, humans plus machines. I think all of the narratives around your jobs will go away are short-sighted, because they don't talk about the fact that, a whole half of the new jobs don't even exist. So you're not even counting those, right? And so that's the transformation that really is going to happen eventually.
So that reskilling or the upskilling, as you talk about, you mentioned places like I think it was in Finland, for example. They're training 1% of their population on AI as an example. Yes. So there's lots of people like from all kinds of jobs, doctors and accountants and teachers, all taking courses on AI, so they can understand, not that they're going to be data scientists, but really so they can understand how it's going to change the work that they do. You're based in the US. How well do you feel the governments and the policymakers are doing in terms of starting that conversation and starting to put the things in place to do that upskilling?
I think the US needs to do much more. I think maybe the bureaucracy is doing a better job than the politicians themselves.
So we see things happening under the surface that we're not really seeing.
Yes. But that's the nature of politics. But I think in reality, what I see happening this time is the corporate world is starting to bear the leadership in this particular transformation. So we all read that Amazon's going to invest $700 million retraining 100,000 employees. And that's absolutely mind-boggling, because when you think about Amazon, you think, high-skilled tech people that rival, Google and Microsoft. And they're setting aside, almost $750 million to retrain those, relatively new people. But they're not alone. AT&T announced a few years ago that they were setting aside $1 billion to retrain, 100,000 people. Loblaws, the Canadian retailer, has set aside, I think, $250 million to retrain their force, right? So you have these companies that are forward-thinking, that are starting to, take up that charge, and I think that's great, because that's really essential. Somebody needs to pick up that slack.
And it's also an opportunity that I was speaking the other day at Visa University, the credit card company, and they have campuses in Dubai, definitely in the US, Singapore, Philippines, India, I think. And it was interesting just talking to some of the leadership there from Visa University. They're creating training, but not just for Visa employees. It's also for the partners, for their clients, their customers as well. And I actually think this is a huge opportunity for on the corporate side, is you can actually be that trusted source, that trusted trainer on this journey that everyone's going to have to go through anyway. So you might as well be the trusted source, whether that's, I know obviously Google are doing this already just now. I think IBM are doing a phenomenal job at this, their courses on Coursera, for example. So now the role of the corporate is almost changing into be helping with that education, that reskilling process.
It is, and you're right that it's a win-win opportunity for many of these companies. The newer wave of consumers, customers, the millennials and the later generations, they're much more smarter than old people like me were in their choice of companies, and so they're supporting companies that do the right thing. And so it's good for corporate reputation. It's good for the employees of those companies, and it's actually very, very good for society. So I really think that companies like Visa and IBM and as I said previously, Amazon and others, they're going to lead the charge, and good for them.
Now, in the book, you talk about these 5 stages of digital transformation. Can you just give us an overview of what those stages are, just so we can start to think about, if anyone's watching, listening to this just now, where they are individually, where their organization is in these stages? Yes.
So a little bit of context. I defined the 5 stages. Again, I talked earlier about the 2 problems why 70% failure rate. And the first one is to understand what exactly is digital transformation. And it's a spectrum, because if you're a software provider today, all you have to say is, I'm in the business of AI and digital transformation, and you get a 20% pickup in sales, right? So to help customers figure out where they are, I created the scale. Stage 1 is basically what I call foundation, but really it's just automation. So you're doing your ERP, your SAP, so on and so forth. Stage 5, on the other hand, is what I call living DNA, where digital capabilities become the DNA of your company. The ability to constantly disrupt yourselves like a Netflix over and over again. And that's baked into the culture. That's stage 5. In the middle, stage 2 is what I call siloed. So you may have within a company or within a government one department that's starting to really play with disruptive technology. So finance working on blockchain, that's siloed. Stage 3 is partially synchronized. It's a little bit like GE was under Jeff Immelt, where they declare a corporate strategy, but they haven't finished executing it because, of various reasons. Either it takes a long time or there's something missing in the strategy, right? Stage 4 is fully synchronized. It's when the organization, the entity, is actually able to complete a one-time digital transformation, but they haven't really made it the systemic DNA of the organization. They are just one more disruption away from essentially being irrelevant. So think of MapQuest, think of, AOL, right? Stage 4, but, not quite stage 5. So that's really the spectrum.
So as we're going to go through those different stages, if someone is, if in their business, let's say they're in the silo, that one that you talk about, the silo stage. So maybe in their department or their division, they're really, powering ahead in digital transformation. They're looking at blockchain, they're looking at IoT, they're looking at all these different things and how it's affecting the business. But they have these other parts of the business which are either have their heads in the sand or it's not a priority for them at this stage. How do you start to build allies across an organization for digital transformation? Do you have to find it go right to the top and has to scale down, or are you building networks across the organization?
So I think when you're at that particular stage, what you really need to do is find a way to actually get to the change leaders and the change managers in the organization, and that's both a top-down strategy process combined with a peer level or a bottom-up alignment of capabilities in the organization. So I'll give you a couple of examples. When I set up this organization, which I talk about in the book, Next Generation Services, which was an industry ecosystem to drive 10x product creation for the IT and shared services industry. Rather than filling up that group with innovation experts, I actually picked people that were operational, credible leaders in back office rooms, and then made them the innovation group. And the reason I did that was because I think it's really important for the people that are working innovation to be extremely credible. If those are the people that say, I have found a way to do a 10x disruption, then you bring the organization along. So that's part one. Part two is, it's really important to build allies and for the innovation to be driven by priorities, strategic priorities of the organization. The other mistake that most people do in innovation organizations is that they work on externally the coolest ideas that are available and they try and force them back into the organization. So without that sponsorship, most transformations fail. And those are two really important principles.
And as you were going along, both in your career at Procter Gamble and then also now in the consulting work you do today, was there a key aha moment, a light bulb moment where you went, okay, this is the direction I want to go with my how I can make a change as an individual, or you just made an important distinction in this whole area of digital transformation?
I would say that the big aha for me actually happened when I was initially kind of playing around with the idea of creating this next generation services 10x ecosystem. And I kind of tell the anecdote in the book. I was trying to set up a meeting with the CEO of the startup, and we were kind of going back and forth on setting up a time. And I said, I'm not available next week. And he said, fine, I will have Amy, who I assumed was his admin, go ahead and set up the meeting. And then the next thing I know, Amy has this email that says, AJ is not available these days. How about these other alternative days? And I know that sounds like a really boring story, except for when I double clicked on Amy's link. Amy was a robot, right? So that rocked me back on my heels, because when you think about jobs that are really, really, human critical, the admin assistant of a CEO ranks right up there, right? And for me to realize that the world is changing so that, those critical jobs can now be capably done by robots was absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, that's what I was, to be quite honest, at that time, I was still waffling about, is all of this digital transformation stuff just hype, or is it even possible? And for me to basically say, not only is it possible, but it exists in very specific situations. I mean, that really, really helped me.
That system you're talking about, I don't know if it's the same one. I had my assistant, my human assistant, trial a couple of these, and one of the things that came up very quickly was actually not so much a technical issue, was an ethical one. Is, do you let the person know that this is an AI that you're in conversation with? And we actually kind of went back and forth a little bit on trying to decide what to do or not on that, because then that's you bringing in the human, the ethical side of it.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think there is certainly an ethical question around some of these. And I do think that, the world is figuring out its ethics along the way. I personally believe that, it's absolutely essential to let people know, when you're dealing with a human versus a robot, right? Otherwise, it's going to continue to feed the fears of
the Terminator. So a couple of final questions for you as we start to finish off here. I would love if you were to recommend one book that, not one of your own books, but a book by another author you think, if maybe people are interested in this area of digital transformation, or just a book you think more people should be reading on some of the bigger, the more 50,000 feet level of all this. What would that book be?
So I have a couple of books that I absolutely love. One is a book called The Driver in the Driverless Car. It's by a great author named Vivek Wadhwa. And I think that's a fantastic book on the pros and cons of this, digital era. And I like the book because I think Vivek does a really good job of laying out both sides of the story, right? I confess to being a little biased and an optimist, but I think he does a good job of basically just laying out the data and letting you decide, right? The other book that I love a lot was published a few years ago by a great doctor named Atul Gawande. And the book is called The Checklist Manifesto. And it's the story of how the reapplication of the checklists that are used in the airline industry ended up improving the quality of medical healthcare and reduction in the percentage of errors in the medical industry. And that was a huge influence for me to come out with the checklists that are part of a wide digital transformation sphere.
They're both fantastic. I've heard of this first book. I haven't actually read it yet, so I'm gonna read that. The Checklist Manifesto is really interesting because it also talks to like a rules-based system, and obviously some of the AIs that we're now, they're not a rules-based system, and we don't even know how it's making the rules. So it's like, what is that kind of step in between? Is that first moving from first of all automation, and then you can move on from there. So those are great suggestions. What about if you were to recommend one album, one piece of music? What would that be? I'm
a big Mark Knopfler fan, and I think his latest music is absolutely fabulous. I have to say that my favorite album of Knopfler is actually from a few years ago, the Tracker, and I think I mean he's a great musician because you can see him learning and evolving quite literally with every album. So again, my favorite.
Fantastic. So we'll put the links for that down here as well. And any apps or tools that you find particularly useful for the work you do?
I do. I mean, I think I'm a big fan of the traditional cloud-based tools. I mean, I can't tell you how many free tools that are out there that I've used. I mean, I end up using a tool called Kami, Kami, when I was editing my book, and I just wanted to put it out there and have hundreds of people do edits, and you can go get that. And then when I was doing, mind mapping, brainstorming, there was a tool called Coggle, C-O-G-G-L-E. That was fantastic. When I was doing video editing, I just went online and again found a free cloud-based tool. I mean, I'm a big fan of some of these very specific task-based tools. They're great at what they do.
Fantastic. We'll put those links here as well. And final question for you. I'd like you to imagine you woke up tomorrow morning, Tony, and you have to start from scratch. So you have all the skills, all the knowledge you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you. You know no one. What would you do? How would you restart things?
The first thing I would do is I would reach out to build my ecosystem. This is the number one lesson I've learned through the journey. I think this is an era where you may be the smartest guy on earth, but your supportive ecosystem is going to be 1,000,000 times smarter than you are, right? So even when I was doing this disruptive innovation ecosystem for Procter Gamble, I brought together, half a dozen and more IT companies. These are the top IT companies, and said, please come join us. I'm not going to pay you, but you will be part of essentially creating a 10x tool. I reached out to the venture capitalists and said, I'm going to give a marketplace to your startups, right? And I reached out to the broader community at Procter & Gamble and said, please help me to do this, right? And I think that's the way to go about it. I mean, I think find out, who are the people that you need to surround yourself and create win-win opportunities for the whole ecosystem to support each other.
Great advice. Fantastic advice. And if people want to learn more about the book and also learn more about your speaking and your consulting, the other things you have going on, where's the best place for them to go and do that?
So the best place would be our website, which is transformant.io. So that's the word transform and the insect ant, all as one word, .io, India, Oscar. The book is called Why Digital Transformations Fail. And again, there's the link, whydigitaltransformationsfail.com.
Fantastic. Well, Tony, thank you so much for coming on today. We'll put all these links here below in the show notes. I wish you all great success with the book and getting this message out there around digital transformation. If ever there was a message whose time has come, it is definitely yours just now as well. So all the best.
Thank you very much. A real pleasure, James.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.